Hello and welcome to today's Manhattan Project meeting of the LaRouche Organization for Saturday, June 12th. 2 weeks from today, on Saturday, June 26th, a two-day conference will commence. The conference is sponsored by the Schiller Institute, and the title of the conference is For the Common Good of All People, Not Rules Benefiting the Few. The conference is particularly dedicated to discussing the application of a method of thinking to solving what are believed to be insoluble problems in multiple fields, including politics. It's called the method of the coincidence of opposites. It was something that was responsible as a method for the invention of the science of physical economy by Gottfried Leibniz back in the 17th century, and it was pioneered by Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa on the 15th century. This is a particular individual who Helga Zepp LaRouche, the founder of the Schiller Institute, did a lot of work on originally. Now, the method of the coincidence of opposites emphasizes the idea of the commonwealth or the general welfare of mankind, and it opposes the despotic, irrational idea of a rules-based order. In the 15th century, when this method was adopted, it led to a simultaneous increase in human population, standards of living, energy production and consumption, and even improvements in the biosphere itself. 20 years ago, in May of 2001, Lyndon LaRouche was engaged in a dialogue, this was in Germany, Bad Schwalbach, with Russian economists. Two of them who were in attendance were Sergei Glaziev, who was the author of a book called Genocide, Russia and the New World Order, and Stanislav Menshikov, who was the author of a book called The Anatomy of Russian Capitalism. And they were, among others, in that audience. And at that time, what happened was that Lyndon LaRouche made some observations on President Franklin Roosevelt, which we're about to share with you, and as well on the difference between the principle of the general welfare, or the common good, and the mythical idea of money.
So Franklin Roosevelt came in very simply. Franklin Roosevelt had poliomyelitis, was crippled. He fought against the crippling effect of polio, and during this period restudied his own roots. He was a descendant of one of the collaborators of Alexander Hamilton some centuries before. And he studied found again his roots in the American Revolution, and brought forth as governor of New York and as candidate for president of the United States, brought forth a conception which transformed that traditionally ultra-racist party called the Democratic Party. Remember, the Democratic Party was conceived as a racist, treasonous party, and remained so until Roosevelt became president, even though there were some decent people in it from time to time. Roosevelt changed that. Roosevelt transformed the Democratic Party from the party of racism and treason into a party which is committed to the promotion of the general welfare. Not that he was able to act with a sweep of the hand to install the general welfare, but he fought to establish the principle. And most important, he fought to establish the principle in the minds of the American citizens. We've come to a time when people suddenly realize that my money is not the essence of humanity or life. The essence of the ability to buy is not the essence of life. It's being human that's the essence of life. And when people have taken away from them some of the false values to which they've clung too ardently, sometimes they're forced to look and say, what is really valuable? And sometimes, for that reason, it's the poor who are the best fighters for freedom, because they have the least to lose. And freedom means everything to them, because they have nothing else except the fight for freedom. And so when we come to a time of great peril and depravity and whatnot as we are now, in that time, the secret is leadership. The secret is the development and spread of ideas, sound ideas, which enable people to mobilize themselves about actions which will address the problem. And in such a moment, when that occurs, suddenly the majority of people are able to decide on how to run this planet. and those few tyrants who dominate us become pitiful wrecks running into places of refuge or hiding or changing their identity. Thank you.
Now, this idea of the spreading of ideas and the acceptance of ideas, no matter from whom they come, if the ideas are true, is the essence of the idea of the Committee for the Coincidence of Opposites and the method of the coincidence of opposites. This is, again, a recent organizational initiative that was created by Helga Sepp-LaRouche about a year ago in response to the murder of George Floyd. And it's something that, however, applies as a method more universally. Matter of fact, this past week, I think it was Tuesday of this past week, President Vladimir Putin was giving a speech in Russia to a group of social workers, and his statement to them was almost identical, almost to the words, but it was identical to the outlook of the late 17th, early 18th century Massachusetts thinker and scientist and patriot Cotton Mather. President Putin stated, "The very values of mercy, love for one's neighbor, and support for those in need bind and consolidate the entire centuries-old history of our people. They constitute the spiritual basis of the traditional religions of Russia. The fundamental aim of life should be to do good." Those are his exact words. Now, Cotton Mather, 311 years earlier, had said this: "In a word, the kingdom of God in the world calls for innumerable services from us. To do such things is to do good." What if Putin's statement on the purpose and relationship between humanity and government, which so closely echoed the premise, the exposition, and the very words nearly of Cotton Mather's 1710 Essays to Do Good, what if that were taken as the basis for defining a new era in diplomacy and economic cooperation among nations, in this era of the coronavirus in particular? Again, referring to this dialogue of 20 years ago, Lyndon LaRouche gave a kind of precise description of Russia's possible role in the diplomacy of the coincidence of opposites.
Now, the peculiar part of this is the case of Russia. Russia has gone from communism to liberalism without passing go, and certainly without getting $20 or $200. It got nothing. As a matter of fact, it lost money on the deal, as anyone knows. So Russia, the problem in Russia is to define itself, again, intention. This will work if Russia adopts the intention of playing that role for itself in a Eurasian development program, which means leading people in Russia must adopt such a perspective. And the Russian people must increasingly participate in that vision of the role of Russia in changing the situation in Eurasia and in Russia itself. Under those conditions, therefore, the role of Russia as a pivot with other parts of Eurasia is crucial. How? Well, first of all, there are conflicts of a historical and cultural nature among most of the nations of Asia. China and India, for example. China and Japan. Korea with China and Japan. And so forth and so on. So that on a bilateral basis, long-term agreements among these nations are very difficult to manage. However, if you have a common mission with a common interest, which involves a great number of these nations together, then you can bring them together in the system of cooperation. This is the natural role in which Russia can play a mediating part throughout Eurasia. What came up with Primakov when Primakov was prime minister on the triangular cooperation which we boosted very much and pushed for among Russia, China, and India to bring the nations of Asia together in this form. That is a viable idea. It has to be given more legs to walk on and a mind to direct it in that sense. But now in Western Europe, which is potentially a place we can revive the kind of high technology export potential which once existed in Germany, Italy, and so forth. Western Europe has to adopt a mission. Central Europe has to adopt a mission of participating in this development of Eurasia as a group of sovereign nation states through instrumentalities which they create among themselves to facilitate this cooperation. The object would be to bring the United States in to cooperate with that great venture.
Now, that was done by Vladimir Putin over the 20 years that have ensued since what you just saw. And in fact, the Russia-China working relationship is one of the great, not only boons to humanity, but it's actually the basis for a collaboration which the United States should be involved with, inclusive of India as well. India, of course, is right now particularly racked by the coronavirus, but it's also true that the world as a whole faces a sort of circumstance where a joint cooperative worldwide development of, for example, a World Health Platform could be the basis for the most intense form of economic growth, development, and cooperation in human history. But the United States is the odd man out. Now, today, as the Putin-Biden pre-summit process is unfolding, all that in the context of a kind of triple pandemic of the coronavirus, financial meltdown, which is seen in the forms of hyperinflation and various of the bailouts, and a kind of general transatlantic cultural decline, we've convened a pre-conference symposium, pre-conference to the conference we'll be doing in 2 weeks, to discuss these matters. And so what I'd like to do is to introduce those people who will be the participants, the members of that symposium. First, I'd like to introduce my co-host, Diane Sayre, who is also a candidate, an independent candidate for U.S. Senate 2022, running against Chuck Schumer in New York. Harley Schlanger, who a lot of people, of course, here know, who has both become known as a famous blogger as well as writer for Executive Intelligence Review. Mike Billington from the Asia desk of Executive Intelligence Review, who is a proud associate of Lyndon LaRouche for many years and the author of an autobiography, which I would urge people to take a look at. Dan Kovalik, who is many things. He's a journalist, he's an activist, he's written several books, and he's also just returned from Syria. We'll be talking to him in a few minutes. And then there is Mike Robinson of Great Britain, who's a journalist and has also been with us here and involved in our dialogues in the past. So we want to welcome everybody. We're going to start first with Harley. Harley, go ahead.
Well, thank you, Dennis, and hello, everyone. As you know, we're in the midst of a series of summits. The first one is pretty much completed unless there's another dinner with Queen Elizabeth tonight. That's the G7 summit. Coming up on Monday will be the NATO summit, where NATO will be trying to make the transition from a post-World War II defense treaty into a political military global alliance, according to Stoltenberg, the Secretary General of NATO. And then there's the summit coming up between President Putin of Russia and President Biden of the United States. Now, I would argue that the intent of the first two of these meetings was to pull together a strategy to preserve a collapsing empire around a completely fraudulent doctrine, which takes various names: the defense of the liberal order, the alliance of democratic states, or as we're hearing more and more, the preservation of a rules-based order, which I'll be discussing today. But I want to open by just giving you a sense of what Joe Biden was thinking or was told to think going into this from an op-ed he posted on June 6th in the Washington Post, titled, "My Trip to Europe is about rallying the world's democracies." And he starts by talking about the importance of starting in Great Britain with the special relationship, which his Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, waxed eloquently about in his trip there last month with the British Foreign Secretary. Biden said the world's democracies will be offering a higher standard alternative to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative. He said the democracies must together ensure that our values govern the use and development of innovations, artificial intelligence and so on, not the interest of autocrats. And we'll get into this question of what exactly are our values, but do our values include conducting sanctions which are killing children in Syria, Yemen, and in other countries? He went on to say that we will ensure that market democracies, not China or anyone else, write the 21st century rules around trade and technology. And he said, following the G7 and NATO summits, we are standing united to address Russia's challenges to European security. And finally, he said, when he meets Putin, he will underscore the commitment of the United States, Europe, and like-minded democracies to stand up for human rights and dignity. Now, these are words that are supposed to convey an actual meaning, but what they do demonstrate is the precondition for pulling together a military economic force that's outside of control of any sovereign nation, that will dictate economic policies through something called the Great Reset, will dictate energy policies, and through that industrial policies through something called the Green New Deal, and will have the alleged power of US military might to back it all up. Now, this is the reality of what is the so-called rules-based order. And what was discussed in the 2 days of the G7 summit, besides a commitment, which is very belated, to share vaccines to fight the COVID pandemic around the world. I heard this afternoon someone from the White House saying that we're now in a situation where we can guarantee the majority of mankind will be vaccinated by the end of 2022. Well, how many variants or mutations will COVID have undergone between now and then? This should have been something that was taken up as soon as the vaccines became available. But it gives you an indication that while posturing about the interests of all mankind, what we're really seeing pulled together is a military economic alliance to defend the interests of the few and the powerful. That's why it's an empire. And we've identified this as the British Empire because the City of London was responsible, along with British intelligence and the monarchy, for shaping the special relationship of Winston Churchill's authorship to have the United States function as what Lyndon LaRouche called the dumb giant on the British leash. And that's the role the United States has played with a few notable exceptions. Eisenhower standing up to the British, French, and Israelis in 1956 in the Suez Crisis, Kennedy's attempts to move the United States out of an imperial war in Vietnam, perhaps Ronald Reagan bringing in Lyndon LaRouche to negotiate the Strategic Defense Initiative with Russia, and the unfortunately failed efforts of President Trump to put an end to the never-ending wars. But through all of this, the empire has remained in control. Now, I've been looking at this question of where did this idea of the rules-based order come from? Because you do have a principle of international law which should be sacrosanct, which is included in the United Nations Charter, which has been discussed and debated and is at the center of international law. But we now have something different. Now, a lot of this goes to the work done by Tony Blair, who was deployed as British Prime Minister to replace the idea of the Peace of Westphalia. Dennis was just talking earlier about the role of Nicholas of Cusa in putting forward this idea that became the basis of the sovereign nation state, which was codified with the Peace of Westphalia in 1648 that ended the 30 Years' War, the religious wars. And it had several principles. Most important of these were an idea of sovereignty, of accepted borders, and of non-interference in the affairs of other nations. And this included the idea that we should act toward others as we would wish them to act toward us, a restatement between nations of the golden rule of Christianity. Now, Tony Blair in 1999 said, oh no, in the modern era, that's no longer acceptable. That's too weak. What do you do when there are horrible dictatorships? And this began the origination of this idea of the responsibility to protect, that the great powers must act preemptively in cases where there are crimes against humanity being committed. Now, here's the question. Who determines whether these are real crimes or not? Who makes the decision? Who makes the rules? These are not the rules that are enshrined in international law. and the idea of the responsibility to protect, which was especially promulgated by Samantha Power, who, by the way, is back in the Biden administration. She played a very important role along with Susan Rice in shaping the policies of the Obama administration. She's back, along with a whole crew from the Obama administration. And the Obama administration, despite talking eloquently about other nations' rights, sovereign rights, violated them with the destruction of Libya, with the destruction, continuing the destruction of Iraq that was done under Bush, the coup in Ukraine, which triggered a new era of confrontation between East and West, and especially then in the support of the so-called moderate rebels in Syria, which was really a promotion of ISIS and al-Qaeda terrorists. It was only defeated by the Syrian government with help from Russia and Iran. And after that victory over the terrorists, the United States is now imposing the Caesar sanctions, which started with Mike Pompeo in the last administration under Trump, and is continuing with Biden and Blinken. And Blinken has the gall to say that these are humanitarian sanctions, which are plunging 90% of the population of Syria into poverty. So where did this idea come from, this rules-based order? And I just have a couple of threads to give you from what I've been looking at in the last weeks. But there was an interesting speech given by John Chipman, who's the Director General of the International Institute of Strategic Studies, based in London. Chipman has most of his degrees from Balliol College, Oxford. He's lived for quite a number of years in London, although he's an American. And he gave a presentation called A New Geopolitical Challenge to the Rules-Based Order. Now, what he talked about there was he introduced a concept, which is the one that's the implied underbelly of the whole Biden approach to Russia and China. It's called tolerance warfare. And what he says is that when states are unhappy with the international order or wish to create their own order, they seek strategic advantage using methods which are often both innovative and brazen, blending cyber power and disinformation campaigns with the classic instruments of the military. And he calls this tolerance warfare because he says the persistent effort is to test the tolerances for different forms of aggression against settled states. In other words, against the rules-based order. He said what this does is it pushes back lines of resistance, probes weaknesses, asserts rights unilaterally, breaks rules, establishes new facts on the ground, and gains systematic tactical advantage over hesitant opponents. And then he says, who's the leading opponent of this today? Or leading proponent of this today? Vladimir Putin. And his primary theater of operations is in Western Europe and North America. China also does the same thing. And then he comes to a conclusion where he says there's a problem with this. The rules-based order is the basis of a Pax Americana world order. And he said the problem is this is shaky in Asia, it's uncertain in Europe, and it's fragile in the Middle East. And he concluded that defending the rules-based order will require invention and determination in the face of challenges from opponents and usurpers. The effort cannot be borne by the United States alone. Now, I would argue that this is the guiding conception behind the people who put together this summit, this G7 summit, which includes the leadership of the Atlantic Council, one of the leading instruments of the military-industrial complex, which has a project called the D10 Project, the Democracy 10 Project, the Alliance of Democratic States, which Biden has taken to call his initiatives to work with Boris Johnson to build this alliance of democratic states. One of the leading promoters of this is a fellow named Carpenter, who heads the Biden Institute in diplomacy at the University of Pennsylvania, who served as a top official under Biden when he was vice president. And by the way, Biden was the key point man for the Obama administration in Ukraine in support of the coup, the regime change operation in February 2014. Now, this D10 project starts with this idea that you have to pull together, besides the G7, other powers, and they identify Australia, South Korea, and the European Union, perhaps also India, which would make it the D11. But they talk about shared values and interests. They say the countries involved possess the requisite diplomatic, economic, and military resources to act on a global scale. And the initiative began in the State Department in 2008 under George W. Bush. At that time, they were trying to come up with a strategy to counter what they said was Russia's malign intent toward the rules-based order. This is the liberal order, based on the core principles of the free world, the alliance of democratic states. And the D10 initiative of the Atlantic Council says its main focus area is adapting global rules and institutions for the 21st century. Now, it's very interesting then to look at the reflection of people who are being targeted by this. And I'm talking now primarily, we've seen a lot, by the way, coming from China, but I'm going to limit my comments to the Russian response to this, because the buildup to these summits, including the summit between Biden and Putin, has been all about reasserting that the rules-based order is the domain of the Western, primarily Western powers, the G7 powers, and that Russia and China are the main malignant influences in the world threatening that rules-based order. Now, in 2019, in January, Sergei Lavrov commented on this. He said, there have been attempts to replace universal norms of international law with a rules-based order. This term, he said, was recently coined to camouflage a striving to invent rules depending on changes in the political situation, so as to be able to put pressure on disagreeable states and often even on allies. And he noted the trend is to replace the term and concept of international law with some rules-based order. Now, this is what we see in effect with the U.S. Pushing for sanctions as the universal tool of diplomacy. Sanctions, as I said, in the case of Syria, the Caesar sanctions, which target the poor, the sick, the elderly, the disabled, the civilian population, 90% of the population. In Yemen, where the sanctions are killing children. In Iraq in the 1990s, where under Clinton, Madeleine Albright imposed sanctions, it killed 500,000 Iraqi children because they lacked access to food and medicine. And when asked about doing this, Albright said it was a tough decision, but it was the right decision. So to talk about Western values and at the same time put forward this idea of a rules-based order shows either a complete inability to connect ideas with reality, or, in the case of many of these people, a commitment to genocide against one's enemies. The vengeful desire to impose conditions under which the people of certain nations will rise up to overthrow their leaders. That's what was on the agenda at the G7 summit that just concluded. Now, I'm going to finish by just a couple more quotes from Russian officials that give you a sense that this is pretty well known by them what they're facing. And as Helga Zepp-LaRouche has been pointing out since the January 2020 assassination of the Iranian leader Soleimani, that these arbitrary acts in defense of a rules-based order, which are done without any evidence that these were based on aggressive actions against the West or against democracy, this has become the potential trigger for war. And we've seen it over and over, the sanctions against Russia over solar winds, over the colonial pipeline, Those sanctions are coming over the Navalny affair. Where's the evidence? Even the Skripal affair, the Duma chemical weapons attack, which was blamed on Assad's government when there has been no evidence there was a chemical weapons attack. And in fact, the actual agency that covers these things, the OPCW, its leading officials that went there said there was no evidence of a chemical attack by the Syrian regime. So these are evidence-free assertions. Now, these assertions are very similar to what was done with the whole Russiagate. The argument that the Russians meddled in the election, that's why Trump wants to work with Putin, and this is why Trump has to be removed from office. So we've lived through coups carried out on behalf of this rules-based order. Now, one of the coming sanctions is, and Biden said he may do this before leaving for these summits, kicking Russia out of the SWIFT system, which is necessary for the transactions, currency transactions for trade. And this was commented on by a deputy finance minister of Russia, Vladimir Kolyachov, who was speaking in a panel at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum last week. There was a panel on the forum on the whole question of the weaponization of the dollar. The panel described that the dollar is being weaponized through the intensity and indiscriminate nature with which sanctions are deployed, that sanctions have become a targeted political tool that are becoming ubiquitous. Now, Kolyachov, in his talk, was raising this question of the collapse of the financial system. And he said, a new global financial system is coming into being. It won't come overnight, but it is inevitable. The sanctioned countries will do it. Interesting to think about. Now, in speaking about this, Sergei Lavrov had some comments 2 days ago, Lavrov being the foreign minister of Russia. He was asked, what would Russia do if it's kicked out of the SWIFT transaction system? And he said, oh, Russia has an alternative. But we are not interested in destroying the mechanism underlying the functioning of the international currency system and generally the international economic system. Now, what this points to is what you heard earlier from Lyndon LaRouche about the potential for an alliance of sovereign nations, including Russia, China, India, and the United States, to work together to replace this bankrupt and collapsing financial system and create a new financial system that would take into consideration the common interests of mankind, working together with sovereign nation states, as opposed to a top-down dictatorial global central bankers policy, which is what the Great Reset is. So you can see from what Lavrov said, Russia is not initiating this or pushing this, except if it has to, as a defense mechanism to survive. But that's being forced on them by the so-called alliance of democratic states that's pushing for enhanced confrontation. And the alliance depends on two basic ideas: geopolitical confrontation, keeping nations divided, the classic British imperial principle from the end of the 19th century that caused two great world wars in the 20th century. And since then, virtually every one of these endless wars is part of an imperial system that's declining and that's being carried out to destroy nations that might break from that imperial system. And the two big nations now that are being targeted are Russia and China. Vladimir Putin had a comment on this the other day, which I will use to conclude my presentation. He said, speaking as a former citizen of the Soviet Union, the problem of empires is that they think they are so powerful that they can afford small inaccuracies and mistakes. But problems keep piling up. And at some point, they are no longer able to cope with them. And the United States, Putin said, is now walking the Soviet Union's path, and its gait is confident and steady. This is what Lyndon LaRouche warned in the late 1980s, and then again after 2008, when he said that the United States, by being unwilling to work with Russia, unwilling to accept the principle of the sovereignty of other nations, is moving toward a situation where it's heading toward bankruptcy and possible war. And where does the bankruptcy come from? Neoliberal economics. So the war machine is put in place to enforce neoliberal economics on the world, which means you must undermine the sovereignty of nations so they will submit to this global system. That, and not the defense of democratic values or our values, is what these summits have been about. Hopefully, in the talk between Putin and Biden, the president of Russia can get some of this across to the president of the United States. So that's what I wanted to comment on.
Okay, thank you, Harley. And if you've just joined us, we want to welcome everybody to today's Manhattan Project meeting, and tell you that in 2 weeks there'll be a conference which is being sponsored by the Schiller Institute, and it's called For the Common Good of All People, Not Rules Benefiting the Few. This is a symposium we're holding today. It's kind of a pre-conference discussion. And next we're going to go to Mike Billington. So Mike?
Yeah, thanks, Dennis. I'm just going to say a few words more about what Harley referred to in terms of the impact of these sanctions in Russia and in general on the economies of nations. We know that these sanctions are causing vast death by starvation, by lack of access to medicine, and so forth. But in terms of what it's doing to the world financial system, it's another aspect of this which has to be understood because it's very much part of this intentional push by the British imperial interests to break up the world. So Harley mentioned this SWIFT system. If you think about why and how the U.S. claims it has the right to impose unilateral sanctions, which are explicitly outlawed under the UN Charter and the actual international law, only the UN Security Council actually has the right, under the laws set up after World War II, to impose sanctions. But they claim they have the right because of this SWIFT system. The SWIFT there's two systems, the SWIFTs and the CHIPS. The SWIFTs, it does all the electronic transfers, and the CHIPS basically settles accounts. And up until recently, virtually all global trade, all any transactions between countries or between companies from different countries went through this SWIFT and CHIPS system, which is dominated in the dollar. So it goes through the U.S., has domination over the way in which all sales and trade and so forth takes place. And they have simply claimed that since they are party to every single transaction, because it's dollars, therefore they have the right to impose sanctions on people that break their rules-based order. In some cases, they've actually denied the right to use the SWIFT at all in Venezuela and Iran and North Korea, I believe. And the impact there, but also it's a question of secondary sanctions. So, for instance, in Venezuela, they threw Venezuela out of the SWIFT system, which means they can only use their currency and trade for some other country's currency. But just yesterday, the Venezuelan government announced that they had sent 4 different payments through the UBS Bank to buy vaccine, and UBS Bank denied the payments. They cannot buy vaccine. And the reason these secondary sanctions, which means basically that the U.S. says anybody who does business with Venezuela or the other sanctioned countries also will be sanctioned. And this scares the hell out of the big banks because most of their money is involved in wild speculation on Wall Street and the City of London. And if they were to be cut out of that, they'd go under. So out of fear, basically, they don't do any business with Venezuela. And as a result, the people there are dying. That's the way the secondary sanctions work. Now, the Russian situation is, I'll give you another example of this first, because it actually speaks to this. Our friend from Japan, Daisuke Kotagawa, a former leading finance ministry guy in Japan, and who's spoken at several of our conferences, he told this story earlier this year that Prime Minister Abe and President Putin were working very hard to finally resolve leftover issues from World War II. They don't have a peace treaty yet since World War II because the Russians seized a group of small islands north of Japan, and Japan wanted to maintain sovereignty, and they fought over this. But Abe was very anxious to have Japanese industry participate in the development of this vast Russian economy, and especially the Russian Far East, which of course is very close to Japan and which needs huge development. They were going to be building infrastructure, agriculture, ports, and so forth. And this was very close to being concluded, along with a peace agreement to basically divide the islands between them. This was 2013. And then, as Harley mentioned, in February of 2014, the U.S. ran this open neo-Nazi coup in Ukraine, put their boys in power, and blamed Russia, and began imposing these sanctions on Russia. So literally 2 months, in April 2014, Obama went to Japan, and basically he and Susan Rice did the heavy hitting, I'm told, instructed Abe that he better impose sanctions on Russia as well. And Abe was quite distraught. He did impose very, very mild sanctions, but the point was these secondary sanctions sabotaged the entire operation because the big three Japanese banks that were going to be funding Japanese companies building these big infrastructure projects were scared to death for the same reason I said before, that they would be sanctioned and lose their lucrative speculative operations in New York and elsewhere. So the whole thing fell apart. The sanctions on Russia destroyed a huge development perspective between Japan and Russia. So this is the way this thing works. So when you heard Harley talk about what happened at the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum with the deputy finance minister that he was quoting, this is a high-level person saying there's going to be a new global financial system, and it'll be done. It's inevitable. The sanctioned countries will do it. This is what they're facing because they're thinking already they're being sanctioned, and they may be thrown out of the SWIFT. There are people in the Biden circles saying that we should just throw them out of the SWIFT because their malign activity and their aggression. Of course, they don't define what those activities are because they don't exist and they don't need any evidence. So this is what the Russians are facing. Now, besides their concern of moving to this new system, they've already moved to completely pull themselves out from under the dollar. One of the things that was said at that same meeting was that as recently as 2019, 80% of Russia's trade was in dollars. All of their trade with China is now between the renminbi and the ruble. But still, the vast majority of their trade was in dollars. That was just 2 years ago, 80%. Already today, it's only 50%. That's how rapidly they are moving to try to pull out from under this totally dollar-denominated global financial system. And in addition, their reserves, which are substantial, it's about $600 billion, are now only 20% in dollars. They used to be 80%. So this is already having a tremendous effect. The Russian ambassador to Europe in that meeting, a guy named Vladimir Chizov, said that in Europe already has 32 countries they've sanctioned. And this is coordinated with the U.S. And he said that despite the fact that the Europeans say this is a last resort, these sanctions, he said, but alas, this is not a fact. Far from a fact. It is their first choice. And I'll add that the sovereign fund in Russia, which is also substantial, it's about $165 billion, which basically backs up their pension funds and so forth, but invests that money around the world. They announced just last week, 2 weeks ago, that they are completely pulling out from all dollar-denominated assets. Within 1 month, they said they will be completely out of all dollar-denominated assets and moving towards setting up this new global financial system. Rogozin, the head of Roscosmos, who, I mean, if you think back over these last decades, the one beautiful example of what mankind can achieve for the common aims of mankind if the great nations on Earth work together was the space program, where the Apollo project and the Soyuz project worked hand in hand, built the International Space Station. And when the U.S. was stupid enough to lose its ability to even launch astronauts up to the space station, let alone to the moon or Mars, the Russians gracefully and still today carry U.S. astronauts to the International Space Station. And yet we have sanctioned the companies connected to Roscosmos. And Rogozin, the head of Roscosmos, just last week said, quote, either we are working together and then the sanctions should be lifted immediately, or we won't work together and only national systems will work just on your own. So again, you can understand why they're doing these things, but is it wise? Is it wise? No, it won't work, first of all. And secondly, it's not wise because what you're is solidifying the British idea that we must keep the world divided, divide and conquer, East versus West. And they went after Trump precisely because he wanted to be friends with Russia. He was making a strong friendship with China and Xi Jinping, and they went berserk with Russiagate and now with all the China nonsense, this insanity about China committing human rights and genocide, all this Pompeo stuff, which is totally adopted by the Biden-Blinken team. So why? To keep the world divided. So if they are forced by these sanctions, or they think they're forced, that they have to set up a totally separate financial system, you're solidifying that it's becoming more and more difficult to unbreak this division of the world into warring factions. So it's not wise. This is exactly where Lyndon LaRouche intervened and said we have to address the common aims of mankind. The Western financial system is bankrupt. They're acting in not only a bankrupt way, but an evil way. What's the solution? You must bring the four powers together, especially Russia and China and the United States, in the kind of thing Roosevelt did with the Bretton Woods system to set up a new world financial system. And you might think, well, this is impossible, especially with the horrible administration policies we're dealing with. But in fact, it's more possible now than it has been in the last 30 years that LaRouche has been calling for this. It's more possible because the world is waking up and revolting against this evil, and the American people are revolting increasingly against this great Green New Deal, which is shutting down our industrial economy and driving us to war. So you have a moment of great, great danger, but it also is a moment of tremendous potential and opportunity, which we're finding through our work in the LaRouche Organization and the Schiller Institute, and which we will be addressing in this conference with Dennis just mentioned on the 26th and 27th. And I, again, urge everybody to join in that conference. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Mike. Next, we're going to hear from Dan Kovalik. He's an activist and an author of many books, including The Plot to Scapegoat Russia, The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela, The Plot to Attack Iran. He likes to look into plots. And his latest book is called Cancel This Book, The Progressive Case Against Cancel Culture. But he's not here to talk to us about any of those things specifically, although we'll get into it probably in questions and answers. He just returned from a week or so in Syria. And we'd like to hear what he has to tell us about that. And so, Dan, welcome.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. The one book you didn't mention is actually the one, maybe the most relevant, if I can just show you here, No More War, How the West Uses Humanitarian Intervention to Violate International Law and to Protect its Economic and Strategic Interests. And I think a lot of what already has been said, I can build upon, and then I talk about in this book. Harley mentioned the right to protect, for example, which is something that I am very critical of, and in fact feel like my main job in life is to destroy the idea of the right to protect or responsibility to protect, because, in fact, as I think everyone knows on this call, it is just the opposite. It ends up being the right to destroy. And what I witnessed in Syria is an example of the U.S.'s demolition project in that region. And it really is a demolition project. The U.S., I think, some time ago gave up the idea of building and constructing, and now it can only destroy. And in Syria, it came close to destroying that country. We went through, we stayed in Damascus, but we went to cities like Jobar, which is right outside Damascus. Jobar is 96% destroyed by the war. It's incredible to see. It's just mile after mile of ruined buildings. We went to Duma as well, which is right next door to Jobar. Duma, as was mentioned, was the site of the alleged chemical attack, or one of the alleged chemical attacks, which was used as a pretext for further U.S. involvement and war against Syria. It is correct that that alleged chemical attack has been largely debunked. I was there with Aaron Mate, who's done some good work debunking it. The great Robert Fisk, who recently died, journalist for the Independent of London, himself debunked it. And a number of people in the OPCW have said that there was no such attack. And they actually testified before the UN on this. But, of course, the mainstream press has not reported on this at all. They reported on the chemical attack, or the alleged chemical attack, but they've never even given air to the other side of the story. In both Jobar and Duma, we went down into these tunnels of the jihadists that were being backed by the United States, by Israel, by Turkey, by the UAE, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, which is to say, by the way, this was a world war that happened in Syria, right? And, of course, Russia and Iran intervene on the other side. This was not a civil war. This was a world war that happened in this little country. And so we went down in these tunnels, which were incredible. You could literally drive a truck through them. And, in fact, the jihadists did. They're steel reinforced. They go on for miles. These things were in process of being built for years before the eruptions that took place in 2011 and 2012. The attack against Syria has been planned for a long time. And in fact, you may remember that Seymour Hersh, Pulitzer Prize winning journalist who himself has been canceled, if I can say so, he cannot get published anymore, certainly not in the U.S. He wrote an article in 2007 in the New Yorker called The Redirection. And what he was saying in there that as early as 2005, the Bush administration, which of course after 9/11 at least claimed it was going to begin a war on terror, and when Bush said that, he meant Al-Qaeda terror, which was of course being backed significantly by the U.S.'s closest ally, Saudi Arabia. Bush did a few things, arrested some high-profile Al-Qaeda operatives. But, of course, that war never really focused on the real backers of Al-Qaeda, like Saudi Arabia. Instead, Bush went after the Taliban and went after Iraq, of course, even though Saddam Hussein was a mortal enemy of Al-Qaeda. But still, there was at least some lip service and some efforts made against Al-Qaeda. As Seymour Hersh reported in 2007, by 2005, the Bush administration decided that its invasion of Iraq and toppling of Hussein did what everyone knew it would do. It put the Shiites in power in Iraq, who naturally aligned with Iran. So then Iran was seen to have too much influence in the region, thanks to what Bush had done himself. So now Iran had to be undermined, and Iran's allies like Syria. So as early as 2005, the U.S. began, again, as Hirsch reported back in 2007, began arming jihadists in Syria to undermine the Assad government. So this was a long planned project, which came to fruition in 2011, 2012, and in which these jihadists, again, backed by all of these countries, ultimately, by the way, the Syrian military showed that they had gathered passports from 84 different countries from these jihadists. 84 different countries these jihadists came from. It's incredible. They would emerge in these towns from these tunnels in places like Jobar and Duma. And they would literally emerge overnight. They would take over the towns. They would impose Sharia law, begin cutting people's heads off for the smallest of infractions, raping women, forcing people to build their tunnels. They destroyed ancient antiquities. They destroyed Christian antiquities. This was a nihilistic project that was being supported by these outside powers, the U.S., the most prominent one, of course. And so when this war has largely ended, and I'll explain why it hasn't completely ended, people are jubilant. You know, people were excited about the elections that took place in Syria because they believed that this was a sign of some modicum of peace and stability reemerging in their country. And I think that whatever they thought about Assad before the war, they now felt like whatever his shortcomings, he had defended them against this terror. And it really was a terror that was brought upon them. But the war isn't all over because the U.S. continues to occupy 1/3 of Syria. It's the most oil-rich part of Syria. Continues to plunder its oil and water and grain in those areas. Turkey continues to occupy Idlib. And of course, as you mentioned, the U.S. continues to sanction Syria in a very serious way. So much that reconstruction efforts in Syria are slow at best. Again, we saw these whole cities that were torn down. We went to the Palestinian refugee camp, which once had been the flagship refugee camp in all of the world. In fact, it wasn't a camp. It was a city that housed about 1.5 million Palestinians. They had shops. They had industry. That has been completely destroyed during this war. Again, there are small attempts to reconstruct, but Syria, because of the sanctions, has very little ability to get the resources they need to reconstruct after this war, you know, where cities look like, you know, Dresden after World War II. You can't fly into Syria very easily. There's only a few airlines that go there. We flew into Beirut, Lebanon, and took us 4 hours to get to Damascus, to go through the checkpoints and whatnot. It's a very hard place to go to. Of course, it used to be a destination. It's a beautiful country, very peaceful country aside from the war. I mean, in terms of crime and whatnot, Damascus is a very safe city. It's a place that people used to go to for tourism, and of course that has largely ended. They're going to try, you know, to get that going. But the point is, Syria represents an example of the West's plan to sow chaos and destruction in the world. It was successful in doing that in Libya, which was mentioned, where slaves are now being sold in open markets, right? Largely destroyed Iraq, largely destroyed Syria, is now in the process of supporting Saudi Arabia in demolishing Yemen. a conflict which is rarely talked about in the mainstream press. So I'll close by saying, a lot of times, and I believe Robert Fisk himself termed what was happening in the Middle East as the battle of civilizations. In fact, I would term it the battle for civilization, with the West being the power that is trying to destroy civilization in that region. And once one accepts that, and I think it is a fact, an undeniable fact, it's very easy to see, which side you are on in that battle. Thank you.
I want to thank you very much for that. It's already provoked many questions, which we'll be able to get to. Now, if you've just joined us, we're involved in today's LaRouche Organization Manhattan Project meeting in a symposium. And this is occurring prior to a conference that will be happening in 2 weeks, which is sponsored by the Schiller Institute. Title of that conference is For the Common Good of All People, Not Rules Benefiting the Few. Final presenter today is Mike Robinson from the United Kingdom. Mike's been here before, and among other things, one of the advantages we always like when we have Mike on is we get coming attractions. What's the next atrocity to expect in the United States based on what he's observed going on there in the United Kingdom, in addition to what he contributes overall to the strategic discussion we're having. So, Mike, we're happy to have you. Whatever responses you have and observations and news you have for us from across the pond.
Well, thank you very much. Just to start off, we've just heard how hard it is for Syria to rebuild. And one of the things that certainly wasn't reported in the mainstream press, but was reported by my friend and colleague Vanessa Beeley, is that during the course of the war, the jihadis were effectively stealing entire factories. So they were taking machine tools out of the country into Turkey. So part of the problem there is, of course, they don't have any manufacturing capability and no way to regain that manufacturing capability because of the sanctions. And the other problem that they have that's still ongoing, of course, is the electricity situation. So Vanessa lives in Damascus, has lived there for a few years now. I think her current situation is 1 hour electricity and then 5 hours off. So it's a pretty difficult situation. But look, of course, Harley was talking about the rules-based international order and this push by Britain, the United States and the other G7 countries to really do as they please and call it the rules. But they can only do this with a complicit media. And in the UK, we have seen over the last number of years a real push to make sure that there is only one story being told, one narrative being told, and to shut down every narrative which might contradict the official one. So I'm going to just run through, first of all, a little bit of the run up to this, because it has led up to a really key piece of legislation which is just coming into the British Parliament in the next few weeks. But the reason that this is important is that Britain intends this to be the framework for how the internet and media is going to be regulated globally. So I'm just going to run through a timeline, first of all. And the story begins in 2014. I'm not going to read everything that's on screen, but the story begins in 2014. David Cameron gave his UN General Assembly speech. He was calling for regulation of the internet. At this point, the story was that we had to protect the general public from terrorist narratives. Nothing much happened then for 3 years. And then Amber Rudd brought all the major tech companies into Whitehall in London and really started having a conversation with them about what could be done to better manage narratives. So she brought Google, Microsoft, Twitter, and Facebook in. And that was followed up with meetings with Theresa May, who was Prime Minister at the time. Now we're going to jump forward to May of 2017. And Facebook started to join into the narrative about having to protect people. So they broadened their campaign to raise awareness of fake news. And they were publishing advertisements in the UK press about this. But then there was a G7 meeting in May 2017 demanding that the major internet companies crack down on extremist content. So the excuse at this time was still terrorism and terrorist content. In the meantime, of course, the war was going on in Syria, and lots of information, lots of video clips of beheadings, of other things coming out of Syria, and really the UK government, the G7 government's very happy for that kind of thing to appear on mainstream news programs and so on. So let's keep going. In 2017, we're into June, and the tech giants, as they're described, created the Global Internet Forum to counter terrorism, and this was really the first effort by the major tech companies to get together and decide how they were going to manage speech on the internet, and how they were going to shut down particular types of speech on the internet. And let's move on through here. And we start seeing the rise of the fact-checker organizations. Full Fact in the UK is the main one. Snopes perhaps is the more well-known one in the United States. And then we started seeing the tech companies also taking action against particularly Russian organizations. So Twitter banning advertising from RT and from Sputnik. This is still 2017. And then we started to see the issue of trust being raised. And this concept of trust is really quite an important one, because this is something that the British government is really pushing hard, with the US as well. Because if you have a media organization that is trusted, and that media organization is putting out a particular narrative, then that narrative doesn't get questioned. It's a trusted narrative, and people don't ask questions about it. So this became a very big part of the story with respect to shutting down any alternative points of view. Theresa May then in 2018, she announced that the UK was going to start regulating the internet at Davos, at the World Economic Forum. And then later on in 2018, Matt Hancock, who at that time, he's currently the health secretary in the UK, but at that time he was in charge of the media. And he announced that the British government was going to step in to underpin the mainstream press and media. Now, there was major concern from the British government that the media in the UK wasn't financially viable. It didn't have a foundation to build off, because as they moved from traditional print onto digital, and they moved from print advertising to digital advertising, they were finding their revenues being cut. So the British government absolutely wanted to reinforce, underpin, and make sure that the businesses didn't fail for financial reasons. So he launched a review. It was called the Cairncross Review, and this was all about making sure that the tech companies shared revenues properly with the mainstream media organizations in the UK. And then I think we may have mentioned this the last time that I was on, but in April of 2018, Theresa May set up the Rapid Response Unit within the Cabinet Office. And this was to, and still exists, it has been funded permanently, and it trawls the internet for alternative narratives. It is a data gathering exercise. It's looking for anybody that's pushing any particular point of view, and it's there to decide how significant, how much traction it's getting, and whether it needs to be countered in the mainstream press. Then we got the intelligence services involved because here's the Director General of MI5 telling an EU security conference that a great deal more needs to be done about disinformation, misinformation on the internet, and so on. And then later in 2018, Theresa May was at the G7 summit in Quebec that year, and she presented this idea of a rapid response mechanism. And this was all about making sure that, particularly with respect to international narratives, that these narratives were agreed amongst the G7, that there was a common narrative between all the governments, and therefore that common narrative was briefed to all the mainstream press and media in each country, so that each country had the same story. This is another particularly important aspect of this. Still in 2018 then, a new UK Council for Internet Safety was set up with all the big players in it, Apple, the BBC, children's charities, because we started to see the narrative changing from we've got to protect people from terrorist content to protecting children. And that has been a big part of how they've been trying to push this since. GCHQ involved in this, the Information Commissioner's Office, which is the regulator for data collection in this country, Independent Advisory Group on Hate Crime, various other organizations, including Microsoft, NSPCC, another children's charity, Ofcom, you'll hear more about Ofcom in a minute, and so on. So 2019, then Facebook increasingly starting to censor content. They employ the major government-backed fact-checking organization Full Fact to provide fact-checking service for UK content on Facebook. And of course, in the meantime, Facebook had also employed Nick Clegg, the former Deputy Prime Minister, as an advisor. WhatsApp gets involved, obviously WhatsApp owned by Facebook, gets involved in limiting how information is shared on that platform. And then Dame Frances Cairncross published her review in the sustainability of the mainstream press, and that provided some support, institutional support, regulatory support, financial support. And it is now the situation that the mainstream press in the UK is largely funded through advertising by the British government. So there is no possibility of them pushing forward any kind of counter-narrative or even challenging the government's narrative. And then later on in that year, the government published their what they called Online Harms White Paper. Now, White Paper is a publication which leads towards legislation. And this White Paper was published with a view to getting some kind of comment from the general public, but also from stakeholders, as they like to call them, in how the internet should be regulated. And it came to certain conclusions, which are now appearing in the legislation. So let's just have a look at some of the things that they were talking about. Platforms, that's the likes of Facebook, YouTube, and so on, Twitter, and so on, will need to ensure that illegal content is removed quickly and minimize the risk of it appearing. Now, this is important because the scope has broadened somewhat from this. It is now not just illegal content, but is now illegal or content which might be perceived to be harmful by some people. It's not really very well defined, so it's as broad or as narrow as they want it to be. They're going to defend the role of the press. They did that through the Cairncross Review. They're absolutely funding the British press at the moment. They're going to safeguard free speech. We'll explain how that's going to work in 1 second. And they're going to, but it will only apply to companies that allow the sharing of user-generated content. This also has broadened somewhat since that point, because now it not only includes user-generated content like Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, but also search engines as well. And then they have decided that Ofcom, this is the regulator for not only the telecommunications industry, but currently the regulator for broadcast media in the UK, is going to be given the task of regulating the internet as well. So let's just have a brief look at a couple of quotes. This is Nikki Morgan, who was followed as head of the Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport. And she said, with Ofcom at the helm, a proportionate and strong regulatory regime, we will have the opportunity to lead the world in building a thriving digital economy driven by groundbreaking technology that is trusted. It's all about trust. We've got to make sure there's no doubt about the trust that we have in the mainstream press and media. And Priti Patel saying there can be no hiding place for criminals. This is the excuse that they're using to shut down any kind of counter-narrative in the UK at the moment. So let's just have a look at the legislation and how it sits at the minute. Now, I'm going to say, first of all, that the legislation is about 100 pages long. It's extremely convoluted. And what I'm going to show you here is what we understand of it so far. But there is a lot more digging to be done on this because, well, you'll see even as we scratch the surface how this is going to hurt freedom of speech in the UK. It applies to what they're describing as Category 1 platforms. These are the main platforms of Twitter, Facebook, and so on. But there's also a Category 2, platforms that have slightly lesser regulation in place. It's still going to be, for smaller businesses, pretty onerous. It applies to services used in the UK, but it also applies to services which UK users can access. So If you have an office in the UK, you're certainly falling under this regime. But if you even offer your services to the UK government is going to attempt to make it fall under this regime. Ofcom will be the regulator, as said. There is plenty of room in this legislation for scope creep through secondary legislation. So in the UK, we have this concept of a statutory instrument. And so the primary legislation gives the Secretary of State the option to make new legislation as he sees fit within certain limitations. So this is an enabling act in a sense. And although that secondary legislation is supposed to be placed before Parliament, this usually happens on a Sunday evening when there's nobody there. So it doesn't really get much scrutiny at the end of the day. They're saying that the platforms have a duty of care. So they're saying, in line with the government's response to the Online Harm Suite white paper, all companies in scope will have a duty of care towards their users so that what is unacceptable offline will also be unacceptable online. Well, that sounds very reasonable, but then it goes on to say, the largest and most popular social media sites will need to act on content that is lawful but still harmful. Now think about that. Content that is lawful but still harmful, they will need to act on, in other words, take it down, such as abuse that falls below the threshold of criminal offence, encouragement of self-harm, and mis and disinformation. This is what the government considers mis and disinformation. The draft bill contains reserved powers for Ofcom to pursue criminal action against named senior managers whose companies do not comply with Ofcom's requests for information. So this is not equivalent to, for example, a corporate manslaughter charge. This is criminal charges being brought against individuals within companies. There's no hiding behind the corporate structure at this point, and this is going to have a fairly chilling effect on freedom of speech. But the bill will ensure people in the UK can express themselves freely online and participate in pluralistic and robust debate. The problem here is that when you start getting into the detail of this, what that means is that there will be nothing in the legislation that would prevent anybody from setting up their own website. But if they attempt to share any of the content from that website on any of the main platforms and therefore develop an audience of some kind, that will be stopped at that point. So freedom of speech is guaranteed because you can say what you like. You just can't, you can't be heard is basically how they're going to manage this problem. So people using platforms services will need to have access to effective routes of appeal, is what they claim, for content removed without good reason, and companies must reinstate that content if it has been removed unfairly. Well, anybody that has already engaged, before this legislation is in place, anybody that is already engaged with the appeals processes with YouTube or Facebook knows that these organizations simply say that the content was not removed unfairly, or they simply say that they had good reason without actually specifying what the reason was. So this, in fact, is no protection for freedom of expression at all. Users will also be able to appeal to Ofcom, but this is about Ofcom's horizon scanning. So this is about data collection. It's about making sure that they understand that the companies are doing a good job in shutting down particular narratives. But there is protection for what they describe as democratic content. This is any content that is viewed as democratically important. In other words, any content which comes from the government. But journalistic content then, content on news publishers' websites is not in scope because, of course, there is absolute right to freedom of speech. So anything that's on any website is not in scope. That isn't a user-to-user website, so it has to be a social media platform or a search engine. So this includes both their own articles and user comments on those articles. Now, the reason for that is because they stated from the beginning that any user comments on news websites are already regulated by other bodies, so there was no need for the duplication of effort here. Articles by recognized news publishers shared on in-scope services will be exempted. So, in other words, we have the situation that if you are the BBC or you're the Guardian or the Times, your content is protected and it cannot be removed by the social media companies. But if you're a smaller media organization, which is not recognized by Ofcom or the government, then your content is not protected in any way. However, they do go on to say that citizen journalist content will have the same protections as professional journalist content. Now, again, the definition of citizen journalist here is not terribly it's not terribly clear, but we understand that to mean the likes of Bellingcat, as an example, who are viewed as citizen journalists. So they are, again, approved citizen journalists. So we have a piece of legislation here which is about to progress through the House of Commons. It is widely backed by most MPs at this point in time. Most MPs will not read the legislation because it is, as I say, extremely difficult to read. But what it does is establish a framework which the UK expects other G7 countries and the EU to get on board with. This is certainly what they've been negotiating over the last several years with all these other countries. And so where does this leave people? It leaves people in the position that narratives cannot be challenged. And as we, think back to what happened in Syria and think back to what is continuing to happen now with respect to Russia and China, this activity by Western governments could not happen could not happen if there was a fourth estate, a proper press scrutiny of what they're doing. But because they effectively have the press in their pockets and they are effectively shutting down anybody that might be able to provide some information for people that would help people make a proper decision about what their governments are up to, we are heading in a pretty dangerous direction. And I think that this particular legislation is extremely important that it gets revised at the very least in the UK, but everybody in the United States and other countries needs to be looking out for similar efforts there. And I think that's what I've got for you.
Well, Mike, you've now explained for anybody who would like to know what America's love for Alfred Hitchcock is all about. For deadpan terror, I can't think of a person that presents it better than you. We're going to go to Diane here in a minute, but because I know she's going to have a response to this. We also want to tell people we will welcome questions. I'm sure the panelists are going to have a number of things to discuss. I know I do. So Diane, let's go to you first before the rest of us burst out of our seats, beginning to ask various questions and make various comments.
Well, thank you. Actually, what came to my mind listening to these presentations is something that LaRouche was looking at when Obama came into office, namely the so-called behavioral economics, the idea of nudging or the idea of quote unquote majority opinion, that is where such a thing as truth has no standing. There's no need to present evidence. All there is a need to say that the majority of X believes this, therefore it must be true. And I was thinking, as a challenge to this approach, if you were told that you had a very large brain tumor, do you think the best approach would be to herd 80,000 people into a stadium, give them a multiple choice exam on what the best approach to removing this brain tumor would be, and then take the median or the, whatever the most agreed upon answer was from this 80,000 randomly selected group? Or would you not prefer to actually seek out someone with great experience and expertise in the particular area that you're interested in, namely the functioning of the human brain, previous experience doing brain surgery? Probably you would consider the informed opinion of the one expert to be much more valuable and much more likely to prolong your life than the behaviorist's way of doing things, which is to say, well, we have 80,000 random football fans, and they have determined that the procedure to deal with this brain tumor is X, eat more hot dogs, or whatever they would come up with. And this is something I think we really have to battle. And people have become a little bit more courageous, but in a sense, our culture and our educational system have been destroyed to the point that people have very little faith in their own ability to reason through things. I think a big part of this is that we don't no longer have a productive economy, because if you are producing something in the real world, there are definite right and wrong answers. Everybody can't just have their own opinion. Gravity exists. You're going to have to deal with it if you're an architect or and anything else that you're doing here on this planet. So that's really the first kind of problem. The challenge that we have that comes to mind is to create a culture, a dialogue where people can regain confidence in their own internal ability to know if something is true. And what also related to this, of course, is the question of justice, where it used to be upheld. And one of the main reasons why we wanted to get away from the British Empire here in the United States is the question of innocent until proven guilty. That if someone is going to demand that you be punished, they had to come forth with a crime that had been committed, and they had to prove it. Kennedy had that much respect. In the Cuban Missiles Crisis, the American people were shown images that the president had access to. Nowadays, not even that level of respect is granted people. So those are some of the thoughts that I had in response to these presentations.
Okay, I understand that Dan has to leave us in about 18 minutes or so. So I'm going to ask to go to him, see what he's got to say about what he's heard, and then give anybody who's got a question for him the opportunity to ask it. So Dan?
Well, I mean, my reaction is that, I mean, I agree what folks are saying. I think we have a lot of agreement here. And honestly, I don't have a lot to add to it, but I'm happy to field questions.
Well, one thing I'd just like to ask, well, let me just ask if anybody else in the panel's got one for Dan right off. Because one thing I'd like you to do is say a little bit to people, at least, about the, well, two things. One, your latest book on and why you wrote it, Cancel This Book, as it's called.
Okay.
Recalling for some of us the Abby Hoffman title, Steal This Book. And the second is, now that you're back and you have begun to recount for people what you found in Syria, what's been the response that you've gotten? So those are my two questions to you.
Okay, thank you. I'll start with the second question first, I guess. So far, knock on wood, the response I've gotten to my report on reports on Syria have been very positive. I've been surprised, in fact, because in the U.S., as you know, there's so much disinformation about what's happening in Syria, maybe more disinformation about Syria than almost any other international issue. But people seem at least open to what I've been saying and what others on my delegation have been saying. So I've been very happy about that. In terms of my latest book, which is a bit of a departure from other things I've written, the reason I wrote it was because, well, actually, in response to something that happened in my city of Pittsburgh, which is where I'm from and live. And that was the cancellation of a longtime peace activist, anti-war activist named Molly Rush. After 50 years of activism, she was the group she co-founded 50 years ago, the Thomas Merton Center, issued a public letter saying they could not work with her anymore because of one meme that she reposted on Facebook. And the meme was a picture of Martin Luther King, and it said, "Never rioted, never looted, change the world." And I was quite struck by the swiftness and really cruelty that was visited upon her in response to one meme that she took down quickly and apologized for. And it made me feel, that I had to discuss what I've been concerned about for a while, and that is a movement in the U.S. that is quick to judge people, to try to take away their jobs, their status, for the smallest of infractions. And I feel like this is not a movement that is based in, compassion and forgiveness, which I think any movement has to be, and not a movement that's trying to bring people into it, but rather to push people out, which is the opposite of what I think organizing is about. And so, that's what led me to write about that book. And it is interesting, of course, in light of what we're talking about, what I talked about in terms of Syria, that you don't see much of a peace movement in the U.S. anymore. And it seems like the older radicals, like Molly Rush, who are interested in those issues like peace, are the ones that tend to be canceled. And I think it's because, the kind of younger generation tend not to care about those issues and see those issues as passé. But in the end, that operates to the advantage, of course, of the military-industrial complex. So I discuss those and other issues in that book. But that's really what inspired me to do that.
Okay, I believe that Diane has a question for you. I just have a brief comment on what you said. Yeah, you have a sort of the rise of little brother as opposed to big brother. And I'll leave it at that. We will have some other time to discuss all these matters. So Diane?
Thank you.
Yeah, it came in light of the 80 fighters from 84 nations. Who coordinates the fighters from the 84 nations? How are they recruited? Besides government players, it seems that large multinational corporations would both have the money and resources as well.
Question. I don't know all of the actors who coordinated this. Certainly the U.S. was a big player. Saudi Arabia is a huge player in this, in trying to spread this, radical form of Islam known as Wahhabism. Israel as well helped coordinate it, helped move jihadists around, Turkey as well. So you had these nation states, huge, powerful nation states behind this. In terms of corporations, I don't know. I suspect certainly you had the private mercenary groups like the formerly called Blackwater, what's it called now, like ZZI or something. Eric Prince's organization was involved as well. Of course, the CIA, which is intelligence arm of the United States, was deeply involved in this. So that's what I know of. And of course, we also know, strangely enough, that and this was reported in the mainstream press, that some of the funds that went to ISIS actually were run through World Vision and other charity groups. Whether they knew that's what they were doing, I don't know. My guess is they were unwitting pawns in this game, but we know that happened. So there were probably many conduits for this operation.
Okay. Mike?
Dennis? Before
go
you
ahead.
leave, not so much a question, Dan, but a comment. Mike Robinson, whom you heard from the UK, has worked very, very closely with the group around Piers Robinson, who was involved, a group of academics primarily, but they blew the cover on the whole White Helmets operation and subsequently got terribly prosecuted. And he's also in close touch with, as he mentioned, with Vanessa Beeley, who has been also part of that apparatus to expose not only the White Helmets, but also the way the OPCW was then literally destroyed by the British in order to stop the Russians or anybody else from exposing the lies that were being laundered through the OPCW. So you may want to just establish some contacts there if you're going to follow up on your work in Syria.
Yeah, and actually I saw Vanessa there in Damascus. I've been longtime friends with Vanessa and with Eva Bartlett as well. who works close with her, and I'm close to Max Blumenthal at the Gray Zone as well, who's done some good work at this. There's so few of us doing this work, we tend to find each other pretty quickly. So,
all right, Harley, you have any response? Go ahead.
I want to thank you, Dan, for your report, and just comment on this question of the Caesar sanctions. You mentioned the difficulty in reconstruction. They actually have within these sanctions that any company or any country which does anything to reconstruct Syria will be hit with sanctions. And this reminds me of what's been done with the Nord Stream 2, where you could argue, well, Syria's been supposedly an enemy of ours, and that's why we don't want them to rebuild. But Nord Stream 2 was targeting Germany and 11 other countries in Europe, where the United States was issuing sanctions, basically saying that gas and oil deliveries are unacceptable. And so here's where you see the stronger arm of an imperial force imposing a policy of genocide. And I mean, maybe not that many people will die immediately if you shut down Nord Stream 2, but the sanction policy in Syria is threatening lives. And I wonder if you could just say something a little bit about what you saw among the people in Syria. I just add, I've heard the reports from Aaron Mate, and of course, he was attacked by some of the so-called progressives, which shows you the problem in the so-called progressive movement. But if you could just say a little bit about what you saw in the people and the reaction to the sanctions.
Yeah, I mean, people are suffering there. Again, just for one example, I went to this Palestinian refugee camp. I mean, people are literally living in buildings that are crumbling. About 400,000 Palestinians have returned to this camp. And again, they now have no running water. They have no electricity. It's quite incredible. And then, within Damascus itself, even while on the day-to-day level, you don't always see how difficult it is for people. That people are getting about I heard something like $15 on average per month to live on, which is impossible to live on. Most people are going into debt just to stay alive. And the other thing that really struck me was at night seeing very, very young children on the streets begging in the middle of the night. This is something that was unknown to Syria 10 years ago, and now it's fairly commonplace. So I think that there is a lot of suffering happening. And again, whole towns are struggling to rebuild. They can't even rebuild, by the way. Most of these towns like Douma, Jobar, this Palestinian refugee camp, they were completely concrete, right? They were all concrete buildings that are now bombed out. There's really no way to repair them. They're going to have to first level these places and then rebuild. They haven't even started the leveling process for the most part. So I don't know where these people are living now, most of them. A lot fled to Damascus. So it's a very difficult situation. Actually, Eva Bartlett, who I mentioned, posted a very good interview she did with a French humanitarian activist in Damascus who talked about some of the impacts on people there that you can't see readily. I think that's worth checking out. I saw her post that on Facebook. That's Eva Bartlett. So, but yeah, it's a difficult situation. And you mentioned that the Caesar Act specifically sanctions companies for trying to help Syria rebuild, which is just incredible. Of course, the U.S. and other countries that helped destroy Syria have a duty to help reconstruct it. Instead, they're actually going out of the way to prevent reconstruction. So it's not clear to me how that country's going to come back from all this anytime soon, certainly.
I think it should be worth referencing to people that one of the very first operations that the Central Intelligence Agency ever carried out was, I think, on the 30th of March of 49, against the democratically elected government of Syria at that time. And at that point, these operations were connected to things that would happen later in places like Iran and so on, related to matters of oil and so on, but that the deeper history that a lot of Americans prefer not to know, and which the British intelligence agencies make sure Americans don't look at, needs to come to light here so that the lie can be brought. So we did, and what your work is doing is very important. We've been involved in this for a long time, and just want to thank you for what you're doing. And we know, as you said, you had to get going, so just wanted to say that at this point. Harley, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add one other thing, that the point you were making about the reconstruction. One of the proposals that we've made was that the Belt and Road Initiative of China be extended into Southwest Asia, including Iraq, Afghanistan, and also Syria. And the Chinese have sent people there. They're talking about it. They're willing to do it. This brings us back to what's going on with the G7 meeting. This is one of the reasons China is being targeted. The G7 is putting forward what they call a clean green initiative for infrastructure, which is designed to counter what China is doing, counter what they're doing in Asia and Africa, and what they could do in the Mideast. There was a tentative agreement between the Iraqis and the Chinese, and there was enormous pressure put on the Iraqi government by the United States State Department to not do anything with China. And as you point out, the United States is doing nothing to help reconstruct. Think of the difference after World War II, when the United States rebuilt Germany and Japan, or did a large amount of work to do that, to today where we destroy and then leave. So I think this is part of the murderous hypocrisy of this idea of a rules-based order. And we see it in the vehement anger at China coming from the G7. And we'll see more at the NATO conference, where they're talking about extending NATO into the Indo-Pacific region.
I'll just add one little thing, which is that visitors to Iraq are shocked and horrified that that place has also never been reconstructed. Most of the damage, and that was much longer ago than what's happened in Syria, but it's still a total wreck. And that's why they moved in to stop the deal with China as rapidly as they could with a color revolution, which they ran inside Iraq to prevent that from taking place. It's unbelievable how once these nations have been bombed back to the Stone Age, they are kept there by the sanctions and by the power of this regime.
Yeah, well, it really is a demolition project, is what it appears.
Yeah,
it's heartbreaking. It's absolutely heartbreaking.
Mm-hmm. It's what we referred to as population wars back in the 1980s. So thanks a lot for being with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
More. Yeah, real good.
Yeah, thanks.
Very good.
I was very happy to meet all of you. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's good to know. Great. So, very good. Now, if I'm not mistaken, do we have somebody with us on the line still, Dave? If he's still hanging there? If that's okay, well, whenever that's the case, just let me know that we have somebody, because obviously we had to take precedence there with Dan because he was leaving. And I have one just observation concerning what Mike Robinson was reporting. This goes so far as to literally be a process of redefining what it means to be a citizen. I mean, you're talking about this notion of citizen journalists, for example, and the way in which they formulate how this works, right? But what they're really doing is, okay, yes, it's Great Britain. We can say we're not surprised, but actually, this is clearly intended to be a way of describing the relationship to government globally of everyone when it comes to this question of what's seen as internet information access. But actually, since most libraries and other forms of knowledge have been now sort of subordinated to the internet in various ways, it's a different process that seems to be underway. I just wanted to get your comment, and then I'm sure we have other things from other people. I think you're muted.
You're muted, Mike.
Sorry about that. Yes, I do apologize. Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Dennis. I think it goes further than that, though, because the whole Great Reset, World Economic Forum language that's come out in the last year is reinforcing this notion of stakeholders. And so it seems to me that the intention is that individuals, citizens, members of any particular society don't get to participate in the democratic process. It's only the stakeholders that get to participate. So who would that be? Well, it's NGOs, which are usually funded by the usual suspects, and they are helping drive policy, of course. So individuals then, under the new legislation, won't get the opportunity to speak out as individuals. The only people that will be heard are the mainstream press, who are pushing a mainly government narrative, but are also pushing narratives coming in from foundation-funded NGOs and think tanks. And so they persuade us that there's still a form of democracy going on there, but it very much does redefine the relationship between us as individuals and the state.
Okay, so we're going to have a question for you, Mike, in a moment, but we've got our person that's been online, so we're going to go to him first. Okay, go ahead.
Yes, hi. I take it I can be heard.
Yes.
Okay, great. I won't limit it. I'm going to start with Mike because what I'm saying goes back to some of his comments, but I think Diane may want to get in on this as well. Mike, you talked about how the reactions pulling out assets and so on, various nations, Russia and China, less the US dollar, was something that was understandable, but strategically it won't work, that it actually just adds fuel to the fire and accelerates the breakdown process, which of course could lead to war. And the United States has been AWOL in this process. Now, Lynn, that only the common aims of mankind, right, will solve this, as Lynn has always stated. Now, earlier in the broadcast, and many times, of course, Lynn has always stated that as the crisis deepens, and the earlier tape from him was from some years ago, that suddenly people will begin to recognize that it's time to change. And for my first time ever, I'm having people approach me. My years of consistency around the Schiller Institute and Lynn's ideas, this is being drawn. And I think the indirect effect of COVID, where people have been forced to kind of really look at the real physical world, has prompted that. So it's very encouraging when it's completely different to talk to someone. It's entirely different when a person asks you a question and gives you something then that you can work with. It shows that they're actually thinking. So I wanted to express that in terms of being optimistic. That's why Diane may want to say something, because she's a candidate and I'm sure she's encountering this. Now, what I wanted to ask you is, on an institutional level, you mentioned that this doesn't have to succeed, the demise of civilization, that we can win. And I think the idea of the citizenry beginning to awaken, as I'm trying to express here with people writing to me or calling me to ask questions, is a useful way. But what is it on an international level, nations and so on, or even internally amongst the cannibals, that will continue to derail this process of the Green New Deal? We know, for example, in the United States, there are some 15 state attorney generals that are filing lawsuits against the Biden New Deal, Green New Deal. What can you tell us is happening internationally? As you also mentioned that 32 nations are going to be forced to sign on to these sanctions, right, to further accelerate this. What fights can you tell us about that are going on? What type of resistance to reverse this?
No, you're exactly right. The combination of the COVID and the Green New Deal is forcing people to reflect back on their own history and their resistance to thinking about the kind of ideas that LaRouche said. I've told the story many times about my first visit with LaRouche in the end of 1971. And what I remember from that speech was his saying, most people aren't going to want to hear what I have to say about the impact of Nixon pulling the dollar off of gold just a few months earlier and unleashing actually fascist economic policies. And I can tell you that this will lead to global depression. It'll lead to pandemics, he explicitly said, because you're going to see public health taken down. It will lead eventually to war. And people won't want to hear it except the one or the two people here or there. We had a phrase, the ones and twos. You have to look for people who were willing to think as a global human being and think about 50 years in the future, and most people won't. They won't even think about a few years back. You know, they have very limited memories, like the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and now we have weapons of mass destruction in the Wuhan lab by the same people who gave us the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. But he said at that point, when this happens, when you watch the breakdown of civilization, when you watch the threat of global genocide, when you watch the collapse of America's commitment to the idea of progress, then people will look back. They will think about who has been lying to them all this time and who's been telling them the truth. And believe me, LaRouche has been marginalized in the media. He's been talked about as if nobody even knows who he is, but almost everybody knows who he is. Lynn used to say you could go into any meeting and just stand up and say, LaRouche is here, and you'll see panic. Actually, it happened just last night at an Assange meeting with Diane and Suzanne Klebe. But the fact is, people do know, and they are looking back. And this is true globally. What we're watching I think you all know that Russia and China and India, the three of the four powers LaRouche talked about, while they have not yet publicly said the whole science behind climate change is a fraud, a hoax, as we have documented extensively, but nonetheless, they have now said that this idea that we have to shut down our fossil fuels, you can do it to yourself if you want, but we are not going to do it. We have development to do. We're not going to sabotage our own development. And nations in Africa and leading figures in Africa who are saying, we are not going to shut down coal production. It would kill our children. And that, of course, is the truth. 50% of Africa has no electricity. Literally, 50% of sub-Saharan Africa still doesn't have electricity. And that is produced is 90% coal. So to say you have to shut down coal is genocide. And the intent is genocide. So what we're beginning to see is exactly what Lynn referred to back 50 years ago, which is at a moment of intense breakdown crisis like this, which is you can't hide from. No one can hide from the fact that we're in a systemic collapse of everything that we've thought about as the system here and around the world. And people know that. So I think that's what you're running into as well, is that they might not quite get what it is, and they certainly don't have a good sense of solutions. But the fact is only the Schiller Institute is not only exposing the crimes, but it's posing that this is a moment of tremendous opportunity, that our conferences, which pull together leading government and scientific figures from Russia, from China, from across Africa, from South America, from Europe and America, demonstrating that when you bring people of goodwill together at a moment like this, you can, in fact, formulate the policies that will and can be spread rapidly through the population and will serve as the basis on which we can do what appears to be virtually a miracle at this point and bring the world together around the common aims of mankind. So this is it's a very dangerous moment. There's no question. You know, we could be in a nuclear war virtually overnight. But we also are in a moment of tremendous opportunity if we act upon our creative powers, which makes us human as opposed to animals.
Okay, Very good. So we have a final question, which is for Mike Robinson, and then we'll take summary statements, anything that either Harley or Mike you have to say, and Diane will then close us out. So, Diane?
Sure. Person writes, your remarks on UK intelligence using fact check, integrity, and quote unquote safety programs to monitor and manipulate people. I have recently seen articles alleging that Facebook had its origins in DARPA programs like LifeLog, designed to do the same thing by US intelligence services. I'd like your comments.
Well, I don't have too much information about how Facebook was, specifically about how Facebook was set up in the first place. My understanding was that there was funding for Facebook from US intelligence services, but I don't know that for certain. That's just what I understood. But in the UK, the British intelligence services are 100% behind, very much behind what is going on with respect to so the tracking of narratives across social media, the reporting of that tracking into the fact-checking organizations and into the media with a view to getting counter narratives from the media. So, we've got the main purveyors of disinformation and misinformation globally, I think at the moment, or I would argue at the moment, are the mainstream media, because they are pushing forward narratives unchallenged, which have come straight out of the likes of the Foreign Office. This is the same organization that has been working so hard to destabilize countries abroad, including Syria. And if you remember back to the previous presentation I gave on the last time I was on with the LaRouche organization, we were talking about the fact that the BBC had gone into Syria in order to identify the opposition voices there and make sure that those voices were amplified. So we have a situation where the established mainstream media organizations are amplifying certain narratives that they're being fed, not only by government intelligence agencies and think tanks, but are working to identify counter narratives. Anybody that is, attempting to make public information which and evidence which goes against that which is justifying foreign policy and so on, and they are making sure, and with the full cooperation, they're making sure that the social media companies shut that down. We can say it, but we can't be heard, and that's really the point here.
I'd just like to mention, Mike, that maybe we can have a subsequent program to discuss what you've been elaborating, because you had a lot more that you could have said, and the work of people like William Arkin, who in a recent New York Times article, is author of a book called American Coup and several other books, talked about as many as 60,000 operatives that were deployed on the internet, kind of an army for the purpose of conducting disinformation and also extracting, if you will, from the internet possible threats. So it's something that we certainly should pursue sometime later. I want to thank you for being with us today. And now I want to just ask if there's anything that, Mike, you've had that you wanted to say that you haven't said yet, or anything else that you have to say in response, and then we'll go to Harley.
Let me, rather than making a statement myself, let's take advantage of the fact that Mike Robinson is speaking from Plymouth, which is the nearest major city to the Cornwall site of this G7 meeting that's going on right now. And Mike, if you could, in 2 minutes, give us a sense of both the security precautions that have been taken and the potential counter operations that may or may not be going on. I think it's worth hearing from Plymouth at this moment.
First of all, there was no real potential for serious protest at the event itself, because the government decided that the best way to deal with that was to create protest zones. And they created, I think, 5 places where protesters could go, one of which was in Plymouth. Now, Plymouth is 150 miles away from the venue, so they felt that that was as close as they wanted protesters to get. The security precautions, they had, I think, 6,000 police brought in from right across the UK. They had 1,000 of them sitting in a cruise ship off the coast, and others billeted in various caravan sites and so on, but also in hotels. And in fact, many of the hotels that were being used by charities to provide temporary accommodation for people that are homeless, those people got thrown out of those hotels to accommodate the G7 and so on, including the security operation. So I think the security operation is costing something in the region of £70 million. It involves the army, the police, and police from right around the country, and also quite a lot of US military equipment on site, including Ospreys. Maybe that's normal, but this has been pretty hard for the people in the local area who have found themselves having their homes surrounded by huge big concrete bollards and mesh fences. So I haven't heard of any particular violent protest at this one. I don't think there has been any, but certainly the security operation has been pretty massive. But the principle that they've set in stone here is that if you want to protest, you do it from a distance.
Yeah, okay. So I should mention that the William Markham piece was actually in Newsweek. I think I said New York Times. That was wrong. And so, Harley, any final thoughts?
Well, this has been very provocative symposium, and it brings up a lot of things. But one thing I would like to just call people's attention to is that we're in the midst of a fight in the United States which could turn the battle inside the United States on this question of the Great Reset and the Green New Deal. And we've just decided to print more copies of our pamphlet, The Great Leap Backwards, which is a very powerful indictment of not just the fake science and the phony ideas, but to demonstrate the degree to which the whole culture has been changed by this anti-human Malthusian doctrine, and how to win it back. You know, what's really striking is that when you look at the reports from the summit, the agreement on the man-made global warming, I saw something 2 days ago in the German press about how Venus, the planet Venus, is having the hottest temperatures ever. And I'm wondering how many men are on Venus creating global warming there. Now, the fight against this is being fought. Diane's doing a lot of work in the New York Senate campaign she's running to expose the fraud of Schumer in this. The problem is that the leadership of the Republican Party is narrowly focused. And so there's no real voice in the United States. While they say they're against the Green New Deal, they're all over the place. And we have to bring this forward. So I really would encourage people to come to register to be online with the conference we're having in 2 weeks, because one of our panels will be on the scientific discussion, not just of the fraud of man-made climate change, but what is a healthy climate? What is it that man can do to transform our conditions here on Earth and into space? So I think it's very crucial that people get access to the truth and fight for that, and that's what we're going to commit ourselves to do, is giving you the truth as well as the strategy to win this fight. And if that's done, if people recognize that there's a deliberate effort to wipe out whole sections of the human race, which we've been talking about in terms of the takedown of the health system, the wars, the sanctions, and so on. Once you get a sense that there is an enemy operation that can be defeated that's very weak, I think we'll get more people to join with us.
Okay, well, thank you, Harley. So Diane, let's go to you. I will also make sure that I announce the panels for the conference once we're concluding. So Diane, go ahead.
Okay, good. Well, I actually wanted to echo somewhat what Harley was saying and emphasize the conference, but you'll go ahead and do that. I'll close by responding in part to Alvin, which the resistance to these policies and the defeat comes when it becomes personal. Like in Germany, when they started to put ethanol in the gasoline, Germans are in love with their cars. You know that from the Autobahn. So once you're going to do something that's going to be damaging to the engines, there was a complete revolt about this. We saw something, I think, similar in the UK, where they were telling people there was going to be a time limit. You had to get rid of all your gas boilers. Everything has to become electric. And again, a total revolt. That's very good. It's very useful. It is not sufficient. And I think one of the most important things that everyone has to consider, even as you are rightly angered about the violations of freedom, of censorship, and hopefully profoundly angered and disturbed by what is happening to millions of people around the planet who are being made to suffer and die for causes that they did not bring upon themselves, is that you have to also think about, what am I for? That is, if I were to be in power, what should the world look like? What do I really want to see for future generations, both in the United States and in Africa, in Asia, in Ibero-America? What should that world look like? And then the other question is, given an image of that, how do you get there? And this is something that I think it's very, very important for people to work on, because you have to have a directionality of what victory looks like. What are we fighting for? Which anything less than that is not acceptable. We can't have a compromise with genocide. That way of thinking has to be completely eradicated. And to that end, I would just underscore the importance of the conference on June 26th and 27th.
Okay, so just to say about the conference that's upcoming, it will be on Saturday, June 26th and 27th, and it's called the for the common good of all people, not rules benefiting the few. I was already looking at the panels. First panel on Saturday will be called "Whom the Gods Would Destroy. War with Russia and China is worse than mad," meaning mutual and assured destruction. The second afternoon panel will be "The Real Science Behind Climate Change, Why the World Needs 7 Terawatts of Energy." The next day, the morning panel is called "Weimar Germany 1923 Comes Again, Global Glass-Steagall to End Hyperinflation." And the afternoon panel for Sunday will be called "The Coincidence of Opposites, the Only Truly Human Thought Process." So I want to thank Dan Kovalik, Mike Robinson, Mike Billington, Harley Schlanger, and of course, Diane Sayre for being on the panel today. I want to thank everybody for coming to listen to us. I want to invite that people would take this panel, and besides viewing it again, please disseminate this to everybody that you think would be interested and would benefit from what you've heard here, and begin the process of helping us build this conference, which will be happening in a couple of weeks. Of course, their contributions, whether to the LaRouche organization as such or Executive Intelligence Review, very much appreciated. And on behalf of the LaRouche organization, we want to again thank you for being with us, and we'll see you again here next week.